Welcome to this episode of Artist to Artist. My name is Aileen Imperatrice. I'm your host and I'm a visual artist. One of the things I find most valuable as a working artist is to get to know other artists, to share techniques and experiences. So today I'm lucky enough to be visiting with my friend Robert Ogata in his studio to talk with him about his art and his process. One of the things that I've shared with you is that I've considered you a mentor for me. And I've certainly come to you a few times in my career to have you review some materials. Right. And I really appreciate that. It's helpful to know that some of the other artists who have been through things can help the other artists.
I find that during Art Hop, I'm pleased that then faculty members will bring their students in, whether they be art appreciation, and ask me to talk about then, what this is about. And I've always enjoyed doing that, because after you have finished your career in secondary education, then you realize that your career in being a painter then is a very different place to be. And so then how do you translate that kind of information then to these young people, about then what they're looking at, what they should be, what they're talking about. And I've always enjoyed that because, it takes young people to go ahead and ask those kinds of questions that I think are very pertinent to them. Yet for most adults, for Art Hop, people come in here and you'd like to engage them in what they're viewing. And but for most of us, we're not quite sure what kind of questions do we ask the artist.
It's so true. I think that, I've experienced that myself when I had my own studio and even when I still have just shows.
Sure.
The difference between questions from what adults ask as to younger people. And I think, again, it's what you say, that the younger people feel a little more free to ask the questions that are, I think some of the adults are a little more afraid to ask because they think, oh, I should know this by now. Right. And they don't want to ask the silly, which, there is no question that's silly because you want to engage them, like you say.
And I think for fellow artists who would come in and have a conversation and so on, there is an understanding that we have with each other, and so it gets into something beyond description, but it enters into analysis about the work. And too often what happens is that we spend a lot of time about description, in which I think is okay. I think if that's what they're viewing and they want to know about those kinds of things, I think it's a wonderful starting point. But I think that there isn't a lot of time spent on analysis because we're not quite sure what kind of questions to ask.
Well, it's interesting. I know for myself as an artist, the things that I come into and ask about are more about technique.
Sure.
And wanting to know how did you do this,
sure,
and the materials used and everything.
Sure.
And it's interesting when I do come across just everyday people that will ask questions like that. And I think there are some people that are getting a little more aware of all that goes into making art because of Art Hop.
I've always believed I have an obligation then. Here these people then make the effort. They take the time to say, okay, let's go out for Art Hop. They make the effort to come to your studio. And so if we talk about process and so on, they have a better understanding about what takes place. How does one do this? So that the next time they visit artist studios, I think they become much more keen, observant, about what they're viewing, and they may have then the proper questions to ask the artist and so on.
It is interesting how, of course, the changing of technology over the years has opened up a lot of other opportunities for people to see things on the internet. They can go do virtual tours of things, and I know that all of us as artists now have websites because it's important for people to be able to reach our work and connect with us in that way.
I've always believed, and I think that before technology and so on, that you have these pockets, regional pockets throughout the United States and the world. And so now with technology, then everybody has access to everything that's happening. The problem with that, of course, is that then you're seeing images and you're seeing styles that are being by the entire country. And so nothing is regional anymore. And so the imagery that you come up with and the imagery that you see in galleries and museums then in many ways seems kind of familiar. And that becomes then the problem with each visual artist is that how do I represent myself, who I am? And we have to go ahead and reevaluate every day that we're in the studio. What is my work about? And then take a look at all the kind of obvious influences that creep into our work, and have to have that kind of, serious discussion with ourselves about, that. And is it appropriate or is it not? That's a dialogue that I have daily with what I do. And it's not uncommon then to find yourself in a position where you are kind of at odds with a series of pieces, or maybe the beginning of a series, not quite sure where this is all going, and still trying to remain true to yourself, and then your own development as a painter.
I know in our discussions I've certainly taken that to heart, because it's true, you really do have to come back to what is innately coming from yourself and putting that into your work. And I think that alone then helps you separate what you do from other people, because it's going to be your specific, unique life experience that leads you to that. And it's certainly been helpful every time I see you in a public venue, whenever we're going to see a show or something, and I run into you, the first thing you usually ask me is, what are you working on now? And I love that you do that, because it always puts me on my feet and makes me think about what am I doing. And it keeps me going along with what I'm working on.
I'm always curious about what other people are doing. Often in too many cases that's not shared. Because we all kind of live and work in isolation. And so there isn't this kind of get-together of minds to kick around ideas and about then, what are the problems we're all having, because it doesn't seem to exist anymore.
I love that idea of getting together and actually, talking more often. Sure. One of the things that I've always enjoyed is when you look through books and biographies about artists, and then you see that they had dinners regularly with other artists that were,
They just got together because
they
wanted to. They want to have that kind of dialogue and discussion, because what we do is so special. And I think that to have that discussion in kind of a ordinary kind of situation is very difficult. So you seek like-minded people.
I think that would make us all better artists, to challenge each other and then to have that feedback on a regular basis.
We have that at Fig Tree Gallery after every person who has a solo show. Fig Tree Gallery, which was started in 1962, was based on that. It was based on them having this camaraderie of group of people that wanted to go ahead and share ideas, and so on. And then through the years, the gallery has changed. It's remained a wonderful cooperative that has lasted, for all these years. We're celebrating 50 years, of continuous operation.
So now, how long have you been a part of Fig Tree?
I've been there since the inception.
Since the beginning, okay. And I understood. Oh, okay. Yeah. And I thought I did understand it the way you described it, that it was brought about by artists who wanted to have a cooperative that they could then show their work, because they weren't having other opportunities to show it. Right.
There was nothing here in Fresno. There was the Art Center, which was this little space above an architect's office. He was kind of sharing space, Every so often you get people and have discussions, and then a couple of people got together and kicked around the idea and shared that with other people that said, yeah, I think that's important. And so you had these discussions in people's homes, and eventually, well, maybe what we should do is then start up a cooperative gallery. There's always been a core of people who felt it was important, even though the membership had dropped and fluctuated at times. But yet there was this absolute need to feel that you belong to a group of people that have then the same concerns.
And that you can then work off each other and meet with each other.
Yes.
That is vital. That's really amazing. And then the other thing that I know that you've had a part in was with the starting of Art Hop.
Yes.
And that was also another pivotal thing we talked about earlier, about the way that it continues to educate the public. And how did that actually all come about?
I was still teaching, and I knew that I thought about retirement, and I thought, well, maybe what I need to do is to go ahead and have some kind of plan, so that I don't want to be all of a sudden then find myself, okay, I'm no longer having to get up to go to school and teach. What do I do with my time? And so about 5 years before I thought about retiring, I said, well, I wonder if I could make it as a painter. I wonder what it's like to be a painter. I thought, okay, I need to find a space. And so then I looked around and I found a space which was on 8th Street. And it was an upstairs loft. I could do whatever size format canvases that I want. I built myself a large table to work on if that was necessary. I didn't have those luxuries, in my home. While I was there then, there were some other artists who became aware that I had this space there. And so we would have discussions. They would come up to call me and say, "Would you like to come up to the studio?" Then my partners and I then said, "Well, let's start some kind of art-related activity." We had early on taken ads up in Fresno Bee. We had made flyers to take over then to the hotel across the street. We had flyers at Barnes & Noble, bookstores, and whatever. Any place that we felt we would encourage people, let them know that this is what's happening.
And that was 1994?
1994, 95.
94,
yeah,
95.
Kind of period
yeah.
of time and so on we were developing this.
The first thing that I did was, once the Art Hop was established with people involved, I came to visit
Sure.
you and others and said, okay, now what do I do? How do I start? What do I
Absolutely. That was wonderful. People were asking.
Yeah, that's the way, it was so beneficial because then it felt like, again, what we talked about earlier, not being alone, you have someone else who you can refer to and learn from. It's been a really great program, I think, over the years, and it, of course, blossomed to be something
people
tremendous.
continue then to, when we have Art Hop, there are people come in and say, wow, what a great space and so on. But, there's still people seeking, some kind of space to work in. And I think what's happened now, whether it be as a result of Art Hop or the fact that there are a lot of young people now that are now encouraged and inspired to go ahead and pursue careers in the visual arts. And so they're opening up small spaces and small little galleries in Chinatown and other places and whatever. And it's wonderful, the response. That's encouraging, the fact that people now feel very comfortable about being downtown and spending then a few hours to go from space to space. And there are lots of, cooperative spaces, and with Gallery 25, Corridor, Fig Tree, and Broadway Studios. There's a collection and grouping of artists who are producing work.
And it makes an exciting
It does, because
space.
everybody's doing something a little different. And so then to be able to spend an evening once a month and say, wow, this is what's happening. And the shows keep changing on a monthly basis, so that's wonderful too.
Now, in speaking about your work and speaking about work in general, some of the pieces that you did, there was a series that you did a while ago, and it was showing at the Fresno Art Museum that really touched me, and it was something that came from an experience you had when you were younger and being in the Japanese internment camp.
Oh, sure.
I remember talking to you about it, and that you had not actually done anything in reference to that until that point.
Right.
Was it you felt you weren't at the point of mind where you could do something that you just didn't want to?
The entire project resulted as being inspired by my youngest daughter. Dad, she said, we've heard you tell stories about this, but we don't know a lot. She was a major in Japanese studies and so on. One of the classes was about then the internment of Japanese Americans and the tradition of all of that had taken place. My daughter called me. She says, we met some people that were very inspirational, in their times, what they had in camp and so on, the literature and the art that came out of the camps and so on. And she says, well, Dad, you need to do this. You need to go back. And this was, at that time, it was 50 years since I had been, since I had left. I had decided, okay, I'm going to go ahead and do this. So then we made arrangements for her to fly out from college. We met her then in Phoenix, and then we had also had access to someone who had been in the camps in Gila. This was the Gila River Relocation Center, and it was on the Pima Indian Reservation. And like many camps that were built during that time, they were very hastily done. This is what we did. We drove down to the space, and there was a gate in which you had access to, and you drove in there, and you find that all of a sudden then that you see things very differently. It's almost like being an amateur archaeologist and smelling smells that I had remembered during the 3 years that I was there. The sagebrush and all the smells of the desert and the sounds of the desert. And so, obviously there was nothing left. There were no buildings or whatever. There were just basically these kind of metal supports that supported then the building. My daughter said, well, this is where your barrack was. And we came to the pond, and all of a sudden I became completely overwhelmed with this thought and this image. And I remember my dad walking out to the front of the barrack, walking down a couple steps, walking over and scooping the water from the pond and washing his face. And I said, that's my dad's pond. And I thought, it was overwhelming, overwhelming. Here was a camp that had a lot of in-ground fish ponds. And because there was a canal that ran on the side of the camp, and that was then, I guess, there was this little carp and other kind of fish that ran through there. And on the other side was my other boundary, which was a dike. It was, must have been probably 20, 30 feet high, in which the Corps of Engineers had built, because in the early stages of building the camp, when it rains in the desert, you have thunderstorms and so on, there's a lot of water that comes down, and so it was kind of washing out parts of the camp. And so they built this then to divert the water that came down this wash, and so that was then kind of the other boundary that we had. So it was, one boundary to the other, and they were physical boundaries and so on. Plus the fact that there was obviously, a barbed wire fence and sentry towers and all that kind of stuff, and armed guards and whatever. You have this ethnic group that's being relocated for whatever reason, and because of the hysteria and that happens during war. So anyway, so we had been there, and my experience with the camp itself was just overwhelming. And I had come back then, and I said, I need to do something about this. I said, why has this not been a part of then my imagery over the years? Because you get kind of involved in what you believe is the direction that you want to move. But this certainly awakened then my ideas about, your life, your art should be about your life, about all the things that have been instrumental in forming that. And so I started to do a series of, I knew they had to be drawings and not paintings. And so I had then, I purchased a lot of paper. This was basically watercolor paper, Italian watercolor paper. And I knew they would be kind of black and white with very little color. You have a sense about how you are going to interpret this information. And so, I would gesso the area, and then I would start to, use oil paint, but, use it in a very kind of washy style. Also then use chalk as, to do the drawings and so on. And then you have this interaction of the oil-based material that was very, very thinly done, and the paint thinner, which kind of dissolved the chalk, and lots of nice things were happening. At the same time then, I said, okay, how do I do this? And I had done these drawings. They were like 30 by 40 inch paper, and I would tack them onto my studio wall. And before I knew it, I had all of a sudden, I must have had probably 10 or 12. And I kept looking at them, daily, and I said, what's wrong with this? What's wrong with all these things and so on? And you realize that then I started to take the drawings and start to move them and start to go ahead and overlap and reposition. I said, well, of course, that's what's missing in this series, is the fact that the series is not about one specific incident. It's about my time being there as a child, an 8-year-old child, and so on. And so this becomes very narrative as you're growing up as a child. You remember these experiences, and so they kind of meld together and start to tell a story as you are there then spending the time and finding out then, the early on what, this adventure that you were on, because, it was all completely different. Here I was, a child who grew up in Selma, California, and find that all of a sudden then you would give my parents were running a restaurant there on West Front Street, and the tracks are right across the street, and that was the main route through the state of California, the 99 highway. And 2 weeks, before my father said, well, we need to go ahead and pack up then, all of our belongings, personal belongings, only what we could carry, and so on, as my older brother and my younger brother, were kind of, what is this about, and so on. So, well, we're going to be moving, and so on, and all of a sudden you find that then, stories like, at Christmas I got a Daisy air rifle, like BB gun, and it was my pride and joy. I thought, oh my goodness, as a young boy. And my mother said, well, you can't take this, we can't take cameras, we can't take guns or knives or whatever and so on. And she said, well, why don't you go ahead and give it to your best friend? And I mean, that's huge. So I, of course, I took it to my best friend. I said, well, we're going to be leaving and so on, and I can't take this. I'd like you to have it. And so, that kind of heightens your awareness of what's taking place. And before you know it then, there is this olive drab army train that's sitting on the train tracks right across the street from us, and there are all these, people who looked exactly the same as you, with cardboard boxes and suitcases and numbers and names that were painted on these things and so on. And here we are. We had closed up the restaurant. Everything was left as it was. You walk across there and you get loaded onto these trains, and next thing you know, you take off and the shades are drawn, and that was that beginning.
For me, it was a very visceral experience because I liked the fact they were very stark.
Yes.
You want that textural feeling of being in the experience and the rawness of the experience, and I can understand why you felt drawn to doing it in that way.
The issue that I think that all visual artists have and so on is that when you think of an experience and so on, then you say, well, how do I then take this information, objectify that information, and that's what goes on then to the paper, the canvas, or whatever. We are confronted with those things on a daily basis and so on. So you want to tell the story the best way that you can as you remember it. You have to be very selective. In many cases, there was a drawing in that particular series in which I want to draw my older brother and myself and my other younger brother together and so on. And of course, because cameras were not allowed, because the FBI thought that was, be sabotage or whatever, so on. So then I thought, what did we look like as young boys, And so I'm just kind of drawing and so on and saying, well, I guess this is the best I can do.
And how long were you actually at the camp then, your family?
3 years.
3 years, wow. So that's why it's so remarkable then to use just your mental images to be able to, because you have no photographs from that time.
Yes, after 50 years have passed. So, you think about those things, and that's why I felt it was absolutely imperative that I take the time to go ahead and develop this series of drawings.
There's a part of me, I feel like, the evolution of how you come to terms with things in your life.
Excuse me, yeah.
It is how, at least for myself, for my own work, how I feel like, okay, I'm at the point now where I can deal with this subject. Because there's certain things that are either positive or negative that happens through your entire life. And you have to come to a certain psychological point where you're prepared to deal with that in some form. And especially as an artist, to be able to make a visual form of that that you can share with others, because it's such a private thing. And your other work that you've done through the years, obviously before that and even after that now, have you felt like that's kind of fed into overall your...
Even though the work, the inspiration for the work, the imagery for the work, the style of the work and so on, I think in part, as I look at my own production the last 10, 15 years and so on, you find that there are certain things that you continue then to do or have done. And often what we do is we put down information, and because the process takes over a period of time and the information gets layered and things get covered up, things get redrawn or repainted and so on. And until then, the work starts to kind of show itself.
Well, I notice a lot of your work has the continuing theme of flowers, and I know that deals with your father's line of work that he was in.
Right. Well, his was actually his hobby. And it even had come, within my mother as well, because I think that you get to a point where you have incidents in your life that take place. The death of a family member, all the kind of things that mark your existence. And so when my mother had died, and you just realize that you've kind of put off doing something for the very people that you love and have shared your life with and so on. And so I said, well, I need to do something with that. When I have shows at Victory, I always try to come up with a body of work that moves me beyond where I am. That's always kind of difficult because I'm here 5-6 days a week, and so you have this continuum with what you do, and you have to all of a sudden stop and say, okay, I'm having the show. What am I going to do? And so the solo shows that I've had at Fig Tree, in which involved Core, the show Core, which were that singular kind of rectangular shape that became kind of a cylindrical shape and so on. There were all these 12 by 12 canvases, you know, row upon row upon row of these things and so on, you know. And it's moving beyond then my comfort level, my zone and so on. But it's allowing me to go ahead and kind of think a little differently about my work. And that was based on then my sketchbooks and what I had done and isolating a particular form. And so over the period of time then I had done then the Nara show, which was in a very, very large scale. It was the first time I had done very large scale paintings, you know, 11 feet in width. And when you change up your work and you do large scale paintings, you know, your thinking changes. Then after that show, then was then the Hana show, which was then that tribute that I had done for my father. And then, you know, again, large scale work that involved then, you know, the imagery associated with my father. And, you know, again, you know, what do you do? So I realized after a lot of thinking that my father, after he had, well, even during when they still owned the restaurant, he had spent, you know, all of his spare time in his garden. You know, then each year then he would then take the most sturdy and strongest flowers and so on, and he would always make sure those are transplanted and then used as then the flowers for the next year. Often he'd be working in the garden and someone would stop and say, "Joe, how wonderful your chrysanthemums are." And he would just go ahead and grab the stem and cut the thing off and give it to him. So I thought, well, of course, that's the imagery I should use then. You know, it's very personal to him. It's been personal then to his life and his existence and so on. And as I remember then, you know, in his later years, certainly, you know, who he was. And of course, in the, you know, the last show at Fig Tree was the haiku show. That was completely different again. You know, I mean, and it's my intent to go ahead and produce a body of work, because, you know, with Art Hop, people come in here on a monthly basis and they kind of see what's in progress. Sometimes the work just kind of, all of a sudden you have this very inspirational time in thinking about your own development. They say, okay, this is what I'm going to do. You set up then you know, a proposal for yourself and have to figure out, well, how do I do this? I said, well, that's what I need. I want this kind of essence of something. I want this stuff that is fleeting, as haiku poetry is designed to do. You know, that consciousness, that awareness of that moment in time.
Do you feel like most of your art is that experience then, trying to give people a singular experience?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I mean, I'm always kind of keenly aware of my environment and what I see, and what, you know, because what's happened, you know, more than I had anticipated was the fact that then you see things that you walk by every day, but for the very first time, that you actually see it, and that becomes inspiration for your work. You know, because again, it's like painting reminds you of something that's been absent, and that's been absent, and yet it's there right in front of you. You know, and you do it every day in your life. So then, when I get in my car, drive down to the studio, or if I'm walking downtown to have a cup of coffee, or just being in my space, being in my garden, all those things become information for what I do.
And this brings us to the end of our visit with Robert Ogata. I want to thank Robert again for spending this time with us. Thank you too for joining us, and I look forward to the next show as we talk artist to artist.